Greetings and welcome everyone to Impact Week. We are grateful to everyone who has joined us for events throughout this week, and we are very excited to have you here for our Friday conference. My name is Maggie Delmas. I'm a professor of management at UCLA Anderson and the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, and the faculty director for the Center for Impact at Anderson. Impact Week is an annual event that celebrates our community commitment to creating a more equitable, just, and sustainable society. With a theme of Power to Change, Impact Week 2021 highlights discussions about solutions to solve social and environmental problems with leaders from academia, business, and policy. Impact Week is organized by the UCLA Center for Impact at Anderson and the Net Impact MBA chapter in collaboration with partners within the business school and the broader UCLA community. So far this week, we've welcomed over 1,300 attendees across the globe in 8 sessions, and we are looking forward to sharing this collaborative experience with you today. Today, we are extremely excited to welcome Congresswoman Nanette Diaz Barragán for a keynote address on the topic of an equitable economic recovery. She will be in conversation with Dean Antonio Bernardo, who is the 9th Dean of UCLA Anderson School of Management and the John A. Anderson Chair in Management. Dean Bernardo became Dean on July 1st, 2019, and has been an Anderson faculty since 1994 as a professor of finance. Dean Bernardo does it all. He's a world-renowned researcher in finance, an award-winning teacher who has taught more than 5,000 students, and a very engaged administrator who has taken several leadership roles at Anderson before becoming the dean. Since his appointment, he has been championing the work of each of our centers, especially our own Impact at Anderson, with the goal of forming business leaders with the right skill sets and mindsets for positive societal change and engaging dialogues between researchers and the community. Thank you, Tony, for being here. Congresswoman Nanette Diaz Barragán was elected to the US House of Representatives in November 2016, becoming the first Latina ever to represent California's 44th congressional district. Very important to us, Congresswoman Barragán obtained her undergraduate degree from UCLA in political science. Welcome back, Congresswoman Barragán. She then, after getting her degree from UCLA, obtained her law degree from USC. During all her career, Congresswoman Barragán has been a champion of social and environmental issues, including fighting for environmental and health justice, immigration reform, strengthening the economy, and affordable and accessible education. The list of her achievements in this area is long and impressive, but a couple of examples here. She began a career in public service in the Clinton administration in the Office of Public Liaison, doing African-American outreach, when she worked for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And then prior to her election to Congress, she was elected to the Hermosa Beach City Council and served as mayor of the city. There, she successfully led efforts to defeat a ballot measure that would have allowed oil drilling in the Santa Monica Bay. In recognition of her work, she received the 2015 Political Leadership Award from the Sierra Club. Congresswoman Barragán currently serves on the House Committee on Homeland Security, where she chaired the Subcommittee on Border Security, Facilitation and Operation, and on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. She's an advocate for comprehensive and affordable healthcare for all and clean air and water for our communities, as well as renewable energy and clean energy jobs. Congresswoman Barragán's background and advocacy in Congress make her a very important voice for us to hear at UCLA Anderson. As students are thinking about their future, and as business leaders chart their recovery from the pandemic under the leadership of a new federal administration. We are very excited to welcome Congresswoman Barragán back to UCLA for this conversation on an equitable economic recovery. Before we begin, I just want to note that we will reserve time for audience Q&A, and you can submit questions by the Q&A box in our conference platform. Congresswoman Barragán, welcome, and the floor, I would say the screen, is now yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and I want to thank you all for the invitation today. It's great to join you for Impact Week, and always nice to speak to fellow Bruins and the UCLA community. It's hard to believe it's been so long since I was an undergraduate student on campus studying political science, trying to figure it all out. Now, one thing is true. There is still a lot to figure out, including the topic of what's needed for more equitable economic recovery, one that leaves no one behind. It's important to me because my congressional district and so many in similar situations have been left behind for too long. California's 44th district is a majority minority, almost 90% Latino African American district. It's one of the poorest congressional districts in the state of California. It's one that I grew up in. As a daughter of immigrants from Mexico, we were a large family. We struggled. We fell right into those demographics of those that struggled and they were hard hit. Now, social factors like housing conditions, employment status, poverty, food security, environmental safety, and educational opportunity, they all play a role in determining our physical health and well-being. I call these the social determinants of health. They all impact our health and our pocketbook. If we don't have equity in these areas, and we don't, we have a broken system. A bright light was shined on inequality during the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 crisis affects all of us, but it's the latest disease to infect and kill Latinos and African Americans at higher rates than people in the rest of the population. A UCLA study that was recently put out found that COVID-19 deaths were linked to poor air quality. Now, it found that people in communities with polluted air died at higher rates. I see what this crisis has done across communities in this country, but especially in my congressional district. Where folks are low income and they don't have access to the services that they need. It has been devastating in terms of lives that have been lost, as well as jobs and livelihoods that have disappeared during the pandemic. And this inequality was made worse during the initial vaccine rollout. As the communities hit hardest by COVID-19, had less access to vaccines and were getting vaccinated at a much lower rate than the rest of the population. So what did we do? Well, it took aggressive, intentional action to get vaccines to low-income communities and to communities of color. Vaccines were designated for community health centers in traditionally underserved communities. Mobile vaccine sites were set up in public housing developments and in low-income communities. Pop-up vaccination sites were set up in churches and community centers. Outreach is currently being done about the safety of the vaccines to overcome hesitancy in some communities. So it's important to note that these changes only happened because policymakers acknowledged that the initial vaccine rollout was not equitable. A deliberate plan is required to directly address problems of access to the vaccine. Now, in response to the pandemic, Congress acted with several pieces of legislation, including the American Rescue Plan. Now, the legislation helped deliver immediate relief for hard-hit communities with things like tax cuts, direct payments going to families. It also helped mount a vaccination program with an eye on getting kids back to school safely. Now, this was the piece of legislation that resulted in maybe the direct deposit that people saw, the extension in unemployment benefits, and helped Americans stay in their homes. Also included access to expanding childcare access to those who needed that extra help, those that have been left behind, those that are the result of the inequities that we have. And so now, as we think about rebuilding, it's, the disparities in health, wealth, and education. And when I think about education, I immediately think about broadband and I think about internet access. These things have only grown during the pandemic. And so the challenges are mounting and we must rebuild. That's for certain. But we have an important choice to make as to how we rebuild. Now, Rebecca Solnit wrote a book called A Paradise Built in Hell that discusses case studies of extraordinary communities that arise out of disaster. She writes about how after floods, terrorist attacks, and other tragedies, there's an opening for something new. Today, we have that opportunity to not just build back better, but to do it more equitable. So how will we decide to rebuild our economy? Will we simply rebuild what we had? Will we have an economy that had long stagnant wages and a widening wealth gap powered by fossil fuels that threatened our planet? Or will we use this opportunity to try and build an American economy that's more resilient, an economy that's safer, an economy that's more sustainable, one that invests in small business, in communities, and in people? So one piece of that equation the Congress is focused on is the American Jobs Plan to fuel economic growth. Now, millions of American workers are out of a job, while America's infrastructure is in desperate need of investment. For me, when we talk about investing in infrastructure, it's things like affordable housing, it's roads and bridges, it's broadband, but it's also investing in our planet and fighting climate, and so making sure we have environmental justice. A more equitable economy is one that works for our community, not at the expense of our community. And environmental justice is at the heart of that fight. Now, it's a fact that poorer communities are exposed to more pollution than wealthier communities. That's the definition of injustice, and it's wrong. My district, just to give you an example, California's 44th. It's surrounded by 3 freeways, the 405 and, well, rather the 110 and the 710 and the 105, along with the 2 ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And it's also the site of lots of urban oil drilling. And some of these oil wells are literally right next door to schools, playgrounds, and backyards where kids play. As a result, we have some of the worst air pollution in the country. And consequently, we've seen some of the highest rates of asthma and lung cancer and lung disease. Some have called this a diesel death zone. And can you just imagine that? This district, that's what it's called. It's unacceptable. Now, too often, the way things work is that the well-being and the profits of polluting companies get put first, while the well-being and the health of people like my constituents and our neighbors get sacrificed. And let's face it, there aren't many oil wells in Bel Air, but our system says that it's okay to pollute in poor neighborhoods. It shouldn't be this way. A few years ago in my district, residents in Compton turned on their faucets and brown water came out. When complaints were raised, I'll never forget somebody said, it wasn't a big deal. They said, it was only a few hundred people. Congresswoman, why are you getting involved? And I was just taken back by the response. I was shocked to hear that response, because we know if it had happened in a community like Beverly Hills or Malibu, the outrage would have started, and it would have been even one person. And that is what the response should be. Brown water for one person is too much, and we need to do something. Environmental and economic injustice are directly linked with public health outcomes, and tragically, this led to devastating consequences over the past year. So what does it mean? This is a unique moment, and we must make bold choices. I believe we must choose to make a transformational investment in a green economy that not only delivers an economic recovery, but also serves as a down payment on our efforts to tackle the climate and environmental crisis that we face. And we can do it in a way that focuses on creating opportunities in traditionally underserved neighborhoods. Now, green stimulus can provide the support to transition workers who have lost their jobs into job-intensive green industries. We can green our ports and create jobs with legislation like my bill, the Climate Smart Sports Act. Now, this is policy would transition ports to zero emissions technology to help achieve both our climate and our environmental justice goals. We can end bailouts and loopholes for the wealthiest and biggest corporations and put that money to work for the people. So equity means that big corporations would finally pay their fair share of taxes, just like the rest of us. This means that we have a moment of rebuilding that presents us a once in a generation opportunity. We have to get it right. There are no do-overs. This can't be a lost decade for our economy and our planet. We have to have this, take this opportunity to make our own impact, especially here during Impact Week and beyond. So we have a chance to challenge the realities long presented to us as the way it is, or we can make bold change. And as students, as academics, activists, and leaders, we all have the power to make change. We just need to take that leap. And equity, the lack of equity, is the core of that problem. And a more equitable economy means everyone gets a fair chance. Now, let me also say that there are many other areas that we need to address for this economic recovery, including addressing things like racial inequalities and injustices, making sure that in an infrastructure bill, we're doing things like broadband and internet. Remember, infrastructure just isn't roads and bridges. It's changed. And for us, making these investments is going to be key to closing these inequalities. So we saw children left behind in the COVID pandemic. We need to see increases in wages. We need to see increasing in the minimum wage and making sure people get equal pay for equal work. And we're talking here at UCLA, we need affordable education. We need to look and consider things like canceling college debt. I remember when a family member of mine got into college and said, I can't afford to go to college. I said, you can't afford not to go to college, right? But students are still coming out saddled with debt. And it's creating an inequality if we have students who decide not to go because of the cost, because they're going to be saddled with debt. And that wealth gap is only going to grow and cause more inequality. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we have to have access to quality, affordable health care to make sure we have plenty of prevention. So when the next COVID hits, we're better prepared and we have better factors that impact us all. And with that, I will close it out and hand it over to you, Adine, for the rest of the program.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. We're honored that you could join us today. I know you're extraordinarily busy, and we really appreciate that you've taken the time to be with us. You covered so much important ground in your opening remarks. I'm sure we could spend hours together, but I know we have just a brief amount of time with you. So I'd like to elaborate on a few of the topics you raised, and then we'll make sure we leave time at the end for audience questions. I think it's very important that you have a chance to raise questions and issues with Congresswoman Barragán today. This has been a big week in the country. This week, President Biden announced a very ambitious climate plan that pledges to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 50% from 2005 levels. I know, are really a great champion of environmental justice, and you've promoted various policies that would benefit the country and your district in particular. One example of that is you've called for a 40%. Called for 40% of federal government's clean energy spending to be directed to communities most affected by air pollution from fossil fuel production and cars and other sources. Could you tell us a little bit about what this might mean for people in your district and what the implications might be for the fossil fuel industry? in particular, and we'll talk about this more, how this might translate to jobs away from the fossil fuel industry and towards the clean energy sector.
Well, thank you for that. Let me start by commenting just really quickly, as you mentioned, about the plans this week by the Biden-Harris administration. First of all, it's great to see the U.S. leading again on climate, on the environment, something that we have previously saw the elimination of some of these words on websites, and making sure we're following the science. And the recognition that we need to invest and we need to go big. One of the things in that climate bill, in the climate plan that was announced, was the need to address our grid. And we saw what happened in Texas. So that's actually something I'm working on too, in these microgrids that we can build across the country for instances where we have a natural disaster. But we need to invest definitely in the grid. And so the call for the 40% of the federal government's clean energy spending to be directed to communities is really this concept that those that have been hit first and worst should be at the front of the line and should make sure that they're getting the attention that they need. Now, this call is in line with the president's executive order announcing his Justice 40 initiative, which calls for 40% of benefits from federal government's climate and clean energy and environmental spending go to disadvantaged communities. So when you think about it, you think about, if you're here in Los Angeles, the communities of Watts, you think about the communities of Wilmington, and you could just take a drive down here and take a look and see what it's like, is that we are not seeing the investments here, and we're seeing the pollution here. And so we're seeing the impact. And so the idea here is we've got to figure out a way, and this is one way to make sure that we are making sure that federal programs are addressing these communities that are hit very hard, maybe disadvantaged communities, lower income communities. And so that should be really the rule, not the exception. And so, I'm calling for it to be priority so that we can address this injustice that's been done. But also, this administration has been committed to an approach where we look at the decisions on what we're doing with an angle and a lens of what's going to be the impact on the environment. And that's something we just haven't had before. And we also need to continue to look at the cumulative effects, right? Not just one project, but numerous projects. So for my district, this would be huge because we are seeing some of the worst air pollution in a district that's a majority minority.
You mentioned something very important. I mean, and I think a common theme in several things I'd like to ask you about today is around inequities. And one of the things you mentioned is the resilience of our energy infrastructure. And we saw what happened in Texas that you mentioned. And what we see often is that the toll in these when these disasters strike are really felt very differently. And in particular, they typically fall hardest on communities of color. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you mentioned earlier about microgrids, other clean energy technologies, how that would support energy community resilience, and in particular, how that might benefit low income and communities of color?
So the idea on the microgrids is that as the climate crisis worsens and our country is experiencing unprecedented natural disasters, they often are creating what we're now seeing as power outages. And so we saw this in California in September when record heat waves created a state of emergency and caused tens of thousands of people to lose power here in Southern California. So keeping the lights on and maintaining healthcare and emergency services can mean the difference between life and death. We saw that in Texas as well with the free conditions. So my bill, the Energy Resilient Communities Act, it will help build a 100% clean energy microgrids to power critical infrastructure for communities in the aftermath of an extreme weather or power shutoff. So this is going to basically keep the lights on for, hospitals, schools, emergency response, and it prioritizes energy, equity, and environmental justice by putting grant applications from low-income communities and communities of color at the front of the line for clean energy microgrid grants. Is centering our most vulnerable communities at the heart of the clean energy revolution. And at the same time, it's going to help fight the climate crisis and reduce air pollution with clean energy microgrids, which too often are currently using fossil fuels. So this legislation will support the construction of hundreds of microgrids, actually powered by 100% clean energy, and along the way, help us get greener and create jobs.
Thank you. Again, on this theme of inequity and disparate impact of various crises, in particular COVID. I think one of the things that surprised me, and I think surprised many people, we tended to think at the beginning of this crisis that this would affect all various communities somewhat similarly, and we've seen that that's absolutely not the case. As you pointed out, communities of color have been borne a much greater cost associated with COVID-19, and also we've seen in the distribution of the vaccine very different rollout in different parts of our community. And I wanted to ask, when you've seen this over the last year or so, what did that reveal to you about our healthcare system more broadly, and what can we do to improve access to healthcare for our low-income communities and communities of color?
Well, I think the big word here that explains it all is access, right? It's all whether you have access, and that has just not been equitable. And what we saw in COVID was we saw how the disparity in your access, whether it was to clean air, to higher rates of COVID-19, your lack of access to healthcare meant maybe you weren't able to go get tested. Maybe you didn't have access to have preventive care for whatever condition you have now that's now making you at higher risk. So while the COVID-19 crisis affects every Californian, it's the latest disease that's hit communities of color. We've seen that here, in the district. And when I saw it happening, my initial thought was, how do we address this? And what can we do? And I was hearing stories of people who were, West Los Angeles, who were able to get access to the vaccine. But then in my district, people would say, I've gone onto the system. I can't get an appointment. By the way, I have a job at the grocery store. I can't be online all day long. And we saw those inequities. So that's when it became an issue of how do we get them greater access? And that's where the fight came in, to try to get vaccines into, local pharmacies when they were being taken away to give to megapods. We were trying to get the vaccine into community health centers where the underinsured and uninsured go to maybe get access to treatment, where they'll be able to get the vaccine for their patients and those in the community. And so it really was thinking through to how do we get like mobile sites, vaccination clinics to go. Just to give you an example, my district covers Wilmington, California, and we, look to see what the nearest location that somebody could go to. And if you don't have access to a car, you can't get there. It's that unequal access to public transit, or it's going to take long and you have a job that's not going to prevent you from going, makes it hard. But getting that appointment was the first hurdle, right? And so that was an inequality. So we just do a better job. And, I'm a proponent of making sure we expand healthcare access to everybody. And it's something that we need to move toward so that we can close some of the inequities that we see. And let me also just quickly mention, we've seen also in the Los Angeles area, that's very diverse. It has a large migrant population, people who were afraid to go get access to the vaccine or to get tested or to see a physician or a doctor. And so we have to change the system so that people don't have that fear. And, at the time we had somebody at the top who was, causing a lot of fear amongst that community. So we have to do a better job, but we have to expand access to healthcare and making sure that for example, when the boosters come out, because we know there's going to be a booster down the line,
Yeah.
What are we going to do differently? Well, I think we've got to look in the communities that have been hit hardest, and we start there and we figure out a system to make this more equitable.
And again, on this, it's such a common theme in so many of the issues that you've raised. And, in February, President Biden and Vice President Harris signed into law a $1.9 trillion economic recovery package. And I wanted to ask you, what components of that package are going to have the most impact, you think, in LA and your district? But in particular, how will that benefit the hardest hit small businesses, many, again, who were entrepreneurs from racial and ethnic backgrounds that have suffered from systemic discrimination? How will it benefit us broadly, but in particular, these communities that have been hardest hit?
Well, I think the first thing that really helped with the American Rescue Plan was it invested in vaccine distribution and tracing and testing. And that is huge because it was an infusion of dollars into an actual plan on how to get the vaccine out and how to get it to folks. And so part of that was to be able to get it into more community health centers, to get it more on the ground, to get it to the people who were being left behind. So that's part of what the package did. That was that if you talk to a lot of folks, it's like, we got to get a hold of the pandemic first and COVID-19 for the economy to be able to start to rebuild and get back on track. So that was part of it. So that was a huge help in the bill. The other huge help in the bill, which was direct money in people's pockets, right? Many of us have called for monthly payments, but in this case, getting a payment, which was, not very much when you think about how much rent in Los Angeles is. $1,400 really doesn't even cover the rent. And so it was some direct payment in people's pockets to help them through. It was more meals. But you talk about small businesses, and we saw that happen, right? There was this great intention that we were going to put out these PPP loans, we're going to put out these grants. But what we learned after the first round of that, it wasn't really going into the pocket of those who needed it the most. We would read an article after article about how the big corporations were getting in the big businesses, which resulted, of course, in this committee created in Congress to provide oversight. And that's where we had to go back and we had to tweak things to try to almost allocate certain amounts to go to minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, smaller-owned businesses, using the community banks as opposed to the larger banks. And so there's just a lot of work to do. And sometimes the intentions are there, the way it plays out, it doesn't work. And that's where Congress has to do a better job of, when we're drafting legislation, in making sure that we are putting in guardrails so that it is going to those that need it the most. We know that small businesses are the backbone of this country. And I think the other big thing in the bill that is going to have a real impact is the ability to reopen schools. We know that kids have been left behind from the digital divide. Not only that, but in many family communities, you're, especially in districts like mine, you don't get to work remotely. Like, your parent is going to work, whether they're driving a bus, whether they're restocking the shelves, whether they're on the front lines at the hospital. And it's just different because those kids, as I've heard from parents, like they don't have the time to give kids the education that they need at home that they're missing from school, or it could be issues like childcare, access to making sure that somebody can take care of the child. So we've definitely seen that inequity, and this legislation was intended to try to help that. But at the end of the day, we just got to build back better.
The last point you made is one that I know, has been very troubling for me as an educator. I know many people feel the same way. The inequitable consequences of the inaccess to schooling and so on is potentially something that could be felt a long time, and it seems like something that is very appropriate for government policy. And you've called on the federal government to invest, I believe, $300 billion in public schools for a safe reopening back in September. What challenges do you see there? But in particular, what are the remedies that we might consider that would help close the gaps that were created, the educational gaps that were created in the last year? Which to me is a very important public policy issue, because the consequences of that could be very long lasting.
Well, Republican or Democrat, we all agree that schools have to reopen safely, right? And I'm proud that the American Rescue Plan, it provided over $200 billion in K through 12 education and healthcare. While that is $100 billion less than what I call for, it's important first investment in kids. So as schools aren't just places kids learn, right? They're also places for friendship and leadership opportunities. In some instances, like in mine, I remember my mother would say, make sure you eat, because that was a place where people went to eat. Because maybe you at home could get that extra meal. It's also a place where kids have access to mental and physical health services. In some cases, unfortunately, it's leaving the home, which is what helps them. Maybe there's a hard, environment there. And so it's making sure we have that space. Now, we don't have vaccines yet for kids. It's still, I think the last time I looked, it was 16 and over, and they were starting to do some studies. So, we do have concerns from parents about their kids being exposed. We also don't have 100% vaccination rates. And so, and the strains, of course, make it more difficult on knowing what that's going to be like. But see, this is where I think if we're investing in our schools and the infrastructure and making sure that when we build back smarter in our schools. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the air system maybe needs to be updated and changed. We heard that in schools that's saying, well, if you bring kids back, the airflow and the circulation, the ventilation isn't good. So we need to invest in that. So when we invest in schools and we're building infrastructure, we need to think ahead and smarter in doing that. So part of that, I think, is that kind of an infrastructure. But then we have the other part of infrastructure, and that is making sure kids have access to, broadband and internet and technology. Now, you could give a kid a laptop, but if they don't have the internet, that's the problem. Or if you give a kid an iPad and they don't know how to use it, and in my case, there's no way my parents would be able to help. They had no access to that. So there's a lot, I think, there that we need to think about and we need to invest in. And I think the ongoing question now is going to just be, it's going to be size and class size and how many people in one area. And COVID, we're making progress on it. But I think you're going to have, ongoing concerns about, viruses and variants, and just making sure that we're setting up properly. So it's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah. Another crisis that has been exacerbated during the last year is around homelessness in Los Angeles. Los Angeles County has more than now 50,000 unhoused residents, and many others who live in precarious positions, really because of the high rents and the lack of access to affordable housing. How can the federal government, or how can the government work in particular with the private sector to supply more affordable housing And what are examples of what those collaborations might look like? That is another extremely acute problem in our region.
No, you're right. It is. And it's really heartbreaking to, drive down and many of our streets here in Los Angeles and to see our neighbors and our community members living in these circumstances. Now, the federal government launched emergency rental assistance program, which makes available about $25 billion. This is households that are unable to pay rent and utilities due to COVID pandemic. Now, this is the type of federal relief that helps families stay in their homes so that we can avoid growing the homeless problem that we need to address. But it's going to be all of government approach, right? We need to all work together, city government, federal government, working together to invest in affordable housing, low to moderate income households and developers. Rather, we're seeing the benefits to low and to moderate income households and developers because it requires and incentivizes developers to include units affordable to low income renters. And just to give you an example, Los Angeles County incentivizes developers through the density bonus ordinance, which offsets the cost of affordable housing requirements. And basically a developer can increase the size and unit of its development beyond existing zones in exchange for producing affordable housing. LA County's inclusionary zoning and density bonus ordinances are current tools in the county's toolbox to address the shortage of affordable housing, but there's just more that's going to have to be done, right? We need to provide wraparound services to those on the streets, whether it is something related to substance abuse, mental abuse. Maybe they just lost their job and had a tough break. Maybe they didn't have health care and they went to the hospital and they had a big bill that put them on the street, right? And so there is so much tied to homelessness that we need to address and policy decisions that we make. But it needs to start with affordable housing, because if you can't afford the rent, you're on the street. And we've seen even kids, college kids, right, living in their cars. It's not something that we really should accept, and it's something we need to work on. So I think looking for those opportunities in that public-private partnership is something we have to continue to do.
Thanks. Before I want to get to audience questions in a moment, but I'd just like to ask you one more question before we do, and that's really about leadership. And particularly in a time of crisis, in this crisis, I think many have also noticed more acutely the crisis of trust, and that the public's trust in government and various institutions is waning at a time when we really need trust to persuade people to take actions that sometimes are in the common good, but sometimes for their own individual good. And a good example of that is something you mentioned earlier: a lack of trust in, for example, the efficacy of the vaccine and differences in willingness to take the vaccine across the various communities. I want to ask, as a leader, how you've tried to build trust among your constituents, and both before and after the COVID crisis.
So one of the things that I have tried to do pre-COVID was be in the community, I like to say, the closest you are to the issues, the people, the concerns, the better you understand and the better that you can help address and advocate for changes to address those. So, we were doing town halls, we were doing a lot of, on the ground events in the community. Clearly when COVID hit, all that stopped. And then it became, how do you continue to connect with constituents? How do you continue to get information out? And that's when we started doing these telephone town halls. And so pre-COVID, our town halls, we would advertise them, we put things out, constituents have to come to us at some location. With the telephone town hall, it's a system where you can get the voter database and their phone numbers from there, and you call to constituents into their home. And what was remarkable was we saw a town hall where maybe you had like 50 to maybe 500 people at the most turn out. In my district, we saw thousands of people on the phones. And so the reach you could get was greater. Now the cost was greater. But in a time of a pandemic, it was about getting information to people. And that's, I think, the big thing with trust is get the information to people and let them decide and let them know what they can do, where they can go to get tested, where they can go to get a vaccine. And so before we would have maybe a newsletter, it became almost for us making sure we had something go out weekly, maybe twice, 3 times a week if we could, on updates, what's closed, what's open, what new curfews might be in place during that time. And now it's getting out information on where there's a new vaccine clinic, where you can go get the vaccine, what's last minute. Because frankly, we have more people who want the vaccine right now than who don't. So our focus right now is getting out the information. And also it's using local nonprofits and organizations and churches to get information out. So sometimes we maybe, talk to a local church, a local community clinic and saying, hey, you have trusted patients or people that trust you. Can you help get out this message? And so using all the tools in the Latino community, we have something called promotores, where basically like there are people in the community that you trust, and those are then go into the communities to provide information because they trust them. And so making sure that we're continuing to use all avenues. But the last thing I'll mention on this trust issue is bringing in the public health officials and the doctors to talk about the health and the science is important, as opposed to hearing it from a public, official or politician, because that's just the way it should be. It's them trusting the science and trusting the experts.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to turn it to audience questions, and you can submit questions on Slido. I believe the link is in the chat, or you can upvote. And so I'll take some of the questions that have the most upvotes. The first question is from Divya Rao, and it asks, since companies are primarily responsible for climate change, environmental injustices, and racial injustices, how can we, and I think broadly and as MBAs, advocate for change within companies as well as hold them accountable for existing harms?
Well, I actually called for stricter air quality standards and enforcement. And so if you don't have that starting with like the EPA and those that are tasked with enforcement, then you're going to continue to have, corporations and companies that are going to pollute, and there's going to be no consequences. So that's got to be the first step. But we also, I think, to continue to as a public, reward the companies that are doing well. And we've seen more of that, more of the effort to promote what they're doing for the environment and how they're good to try to get business. And so us as consumers can help on that side as well. But we do need everybody to step up. I mean, look, the climate issue is going to be something that we all have to do our part in, whether you're an individual at home, whether you're a business, whether you're, another country, and something that this administration is focused on, igniting those global alliances and entering partnerships and agreements like the Climate Paris Agreement to make sure that we are working together. So there possibly could be incentives on making sure that we are incentivizing businesses to go green. One of the things I look at when I do legislation is to try to use the incentive approach. How do we incentivize people to move toward investing in zero emissions as opposed to low emissions, which is going to get us to where we need to go. And so incentives, I think, is something that we can help provide to, government, to business. But we need those in the business field to also give us ideas on how we can all work together.
Great. Your response is a great segue to the next question. I'll sort of elaborate on this question a little bit. One of the things we're grappling with, as you know, as a society, is the appropriate role of business in society. There's been a lot of discussion. For example, recently the Business Roundtable promoted the idea that a business's role goes beyond maximizing shareholder value and includes a variety of other stakeholders. And this question, and related to what you just spoke about, asks, early in your career, you worked in the nonprofit sector and focused on a variety of important social issues. Now you're in government. And how do you see the roles of government, nonprofit organizations, and businesses in solving some of society's most vexing problems?
Well, we have to, again, it's really working together. Nonprofits is something that's very near and dear to me, given that I worked in the space for a long time, is in making sure that government is helping fund and provide resources to these nonprofits that are doing a lot of work on the ground, maybe that some businesses don't want to do, right? And so that has to happen. And we have to continue to do that. We definitely are seeing in Congress now an effort to fund community projects, which is funding nonprofits that are doing work in our communities. But there has to be that the partnership between business and government and nonprofits, because that's how we'll be able to work together to address these issues. Look, I've worked in the business field and area as well, and I know a lot of it is about bottom line and profits, but there is a lot of good that's being done. We just have to continue to incentivize and to lean on businesses to do that good. We saw that happen during the pandemic. When kids didn't have access to Wi-Fi, we had some companies step up and provide that internet access. But we're better when we all work together and we lift people up. And it's going to help the economy overall. So looking at those opportunities to incentivize those partnerships, I think would be important.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Anna, who asks, how do we tackle gentrification and displacement? For example, SoFi Stadium was built in a predominantly Black neighborhood and increased rents significantly and has displaced individuals living in Inglewood. How can we balance both of these imperatives?
Well, it's not easy. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's just not easy. I mean, on the one hand, you hear, we all want to improve our neighborhoods, and then the other hand, you don't want to price people out of the market or push them out, which we've seen happen. And so we need to make sure there's protections when there is investment in our communities. That people are not being priced out, or in cases that there's protections for people who frankly have been pushed out. And that's where I feel there's got to be, better protections, maybe access to counsel to prevent some of the injustices happening. But we got to be smarter about our policy too, and thinking about what are the long-term impacts going to be, what's going to happen to this community, and how do we at the outset address those. And you can't do that if you don't have the community at the table. Oftentimes decisions are made without community input. Maybe they're rushed, or maybe they hold one community meeting. And so there's got to be a better way to do that. And I'm open to hearing suggestions that people have on what we can do better to keep people in their homes while improving their areas and their communities.
Great, thanks. And the next question is from Akalesh and Dorothy, and I'm going to elaborate on it a little bit. The question asks, in 2013, you fought an oil company's proposal to drill 34 oil and water injection wells in Hermosa Beach and into the Santa Monica Bay. And the question asks, how can government and corporations work together to deliver a green economy? And my small elaboration on this is just how, if you could tell us a little bit about the challenges of taking on a large corporation that has a proposal like this that may be quite profitable for them, but may not be in the interest in the broader community. If you could tell us a little bit about what it took to take that on.
Well, it was a bear of an effort, and it took really everybody in the community. What was fascinating to me when it started to happen was I remember hearing that there was an oil company that wanted to come and drill into the California coastline, into the Santa Monica Bay. And my initial reaction was like, really? Here in like Hermosa Beach, where it's a very affluent community, very active. And I just didn't think it was possible, but it really took everybody in the community to work together to go out and educate our entire community against some of what this big oil company was putting out there, right? They promise you the world, new school systems, new police systems, but they don't talk about the health impact of their project and what it's going to do to your respiratory issues, to your lungs, to your health, and how do you put a price tag on that? So it really was everybody in our community getting together, banding together. And I'll remember that during the fight, I was running for city council. Some of the city council candidates tried to come together to get a pact to say, I'll talk about issue. And what are you talking about? This is like our biggest issue. This is our livelihood. And it really did take just the entire community to, people took time off work. People came to council meetings. I ran for city council. That was one of the big issues that I ran for. I said, I don't want this in my backyard. And I think this is bad for the environment. So it was very challenging to do, but we got it done as a community. Now, I will tell you, just to give you some perspective, I grew up in the district where I represent now in Congress. Very different than Hermosa Beach, right? Just very different when you take a look at incomes and just people's work. I went into my district just to take photos next to an oil drilling facility, just to take pictures. And I immediately had security come out asking me what I was doing. I was in a public street, okay? And it was just in the background. I had security come out. They threatened to call the police on me. And my immediate thought was, imagine for a moment that I'm an immigrant, that I'm somebody like my mother who came to the United States, who, when we saw an injustice, I would say, Mom, we have rights, we got to fight. She would say, no, honey, we are just happy that they let us be here. We don't speak out, and we want to just be allowed to stay here. And I immediately thought about that. And I said to myself, this explains why you have these polluters target lower income communities of color. Maybe those might be vulnerable, maybe immigrant communities, because they use that fear to try to prevent you from speaking out, organizing, getting together to fight back against something. And this is part of the inequality that I've seen and experienced. It's kind of pushed me and led my passion for addressing some of the injustices that we're seeing here in Southern California. People in my district, they can't take time off of work, and they can't put in the hours to organize and to come out and to fight. Now, it does happen, don't get me wrong, but it's at a different level. And, in my other community in Hermosa, people have resources, right? They could afford to put in out of their own pocket to this fight. They could afford to talk to lawyers. And it's just very different in some of our communities, like the 44th, where in Wilmington, people tell me, that's why we elect you. We want you to go and fight for us. So it's hard. What we have to do is government has to partner with companies and to saying, how do we get you to move to cleaner energy? How do we move away from the fossil fuel burning, basically industry that we're in now, because we got to think ahead and think into the future. California has been a leader on that, but the federal government does have to partner up to make sure that we are not investing in more oil drilling, but we're investing on how do we create that energy without going down the dirty fossil fuel route.
Well, thank you so much. We're out of time, and as I said at the beginning, I knew we could be here all day and more to address so many of the important issues that you raised. I want to again thank you so much for joining us, but I think more importantly, I believe I speak for everyone here. I want to thank you for being such a champion for environmental, social, and racial justice. We were honored to have you here. Thank you so much for your insightful comments, and we're very proud of your Bruin heritage too. So we'd love to have you back whenever you can find the time. I also want to thank Maggie Delmas and the Impacted Anderson staff and the Net Impact MBA chapter for putting together this event and for a wonderful week of conversations. Thank you all for joining us. I'll hand it over now to Daniel. Perhaps Daniel, you could provide instructions for how the rest of the day will move forward. Thank you all again. And once again, thank you, Congresswoman Barragán. It was a wonderful time with you and appreciate your insights. Thank you.